Gilbert Dreyfus from the University of California at Berkeley. Professor Dreyfus has taught at Brandeis at MIT in the past and has his PhD from Harvard University. He's written extensively in continental philosophy. He's working on a book with Follisdahl in problems of phenomenology, and he's written also extensively in problems concerning artificial intelligence. Published in 1972 a book titled What Computers Can't Do. Professor Dreyfus's title tonight is Decision Making, Minds or Machines?
Our age of scientific objectivity has made us suspicious of unjustified intuitions as a dangerous form of arbitrary subjectivity. This is about, maybe I should explain this instead of just jumping into it. The thing I'm going to talk about is models of decision making, and there are sort of two schools of what ways to look at decision making. There is a side that would say only men or minds can do this sort of thing, and it's intuitive and subjective, and some other view that you ought to be able to formalize or mechanize or computerize the process of decision making. And I'm going to argue against the view that you can mechanize it or make it objective or make it mechanical or formal. That all comes to the same thing. But before I argue against it, I want to sort of make the best possible case for it. So I think I just now feel I better explain that, because for a while I'm going to be on the other, look like I'm on the other side. I do agree with the reason that people would like to have some kind of mechanical model of decision making, because, as I say, we've got every reason to be suspicious of people making decisions on the basis of unjustified intuitions, because if they do that, how can you tell that it isn't just their own arbitrary private opinion? And there isn't any area where the demand for some kind of justification of people's reasons for making decisions seems more natural and more important than in the area of social decision making. A recent article in Science entitled Science, Values, and Human Judgment most perfectly expressed this prevailing plausible view. The authors, Kenneth Hammond and Leonard Edelman, focus on the role of the testimony of scientific experts in arriving at public policy. They recognize that human judgment plays a crucial role in expert testimony, but they insist that arbitrary, subjective, and self-serving judgments should be avoided. Then they note that the only way people usually have of trying to avoid poor judgments, arbitrary, self-serving judgments, is they attempt to, as they quote, they search for scientists who have somehow gained a reputation for wisdom in the exercise of their judgment. But they don't like this. They reject that method as non-scientific because, as they say, it leaves the body politic at the mercy of a cognitive activity which remains a mystery. And they are very leery of leaving something as important as the reasons that some expert arrived at a decision as simply a private mystery available only to that expert, or maybe not even to him. They say that policy-making groups often simply call for, quote, the contributions of talented individuals who can intuitively perform analyses and evaluations. But the authors point out, quote, that such person-oriented combinations of information and value judgments, which cannot be formulated explicitly, are defenseless against charges of being poor judgments or self-interested judgments. So they propose that such expert testimony be itself made the subject of objective scientific scrutiny. Otherwise, they would say, lacking scientific rigor, such testimony remains subject to the unexamined vagaries of human judgment. And that sounds plausible enough. And it's not even such a surprising new idea. The demand that decisions should be based on explicit principles so that we can criticize the principles and either justify them or find them unjustified goes back to Socrates. It starts in, as far as I know, one of the very early Platonic dialogues, which is still supposedly a dialogue just reporting what Socrates is doing, the Euthyphro. In the Euthyphro, Socrates demands of a young prophet named Euthyphro, who was used to making his decisions and pronouncements completely intuitively and mysteriously by his prophetic talents, he demands that Euthyphro make explicit and defend the principles on the basis of which he's just turned in his father for murder. Now, we aren't going to go into the sordid family details of what happened to Euthyphro and his father. The main thing is that with that dialogue, the whole Socratic project of getting people to make explicit the rules and principles on which they act, and then, once having made them explicit, justify them by dialectical arguments or by appeal to facts, that project starts, which Plato carries out and is our whole philosophical tradition. So there's nothing new about the demand that we don't leave decisions to intuition, judgments, tradition, hunches, and prophets. What's new is the confidence that these writers in this science article show that the power of science can achieve what Socrates and Plato failed to accomplish. Because I think it's pretty clear that philosophy has never managed to get clear about the principles on which moral judgments, value judgments, and so forth are made. They're still debating the very same questions that Plato and Socrates debated. But now that science has been successful in so many areas, the writers of this article feel sure that a little scientific scrutiny will clear up this problem about human judgments. They say, rather than searching for persons who possess mysterious talents, the scientific approach to this problem would be similar to the scientific approach to any problem. Analyze human cognitive activity like any other natural phenomenon. And that sounds fine. The authors demonstrate in their article how intuition is to be eliminated by analyzing the judgments of expert witnesses when they're called in to decide some particular question. Now, the article happens to focus on the question, what sort of weapons should be carried by the Denver police? Any particular question of public policy, you could have the same kind of analysis. And I don't want to go into the details of this analysis. The important thing is to note that the approach depends on a Socratic-like demand that the experts, quote, externalize their value judgments. This is to be accomplished by getting the experts to list the factors involved in such a decision, such as the effectiveness of the weapon, the possible injury to the criminals, the possible threat to bystanders, etc. They're supposed to give their analysis of the relevant factors and to give their evaluation of each type of weapon on the basis of their evaluation of the various factors. In other words, they're supposed to take into account the costs, that is, the risks and the benefits or advantages of each type of weapon in such a way that a value can be calculated for each alternative. Another way to put it is they're supposed to give their version of the trade-offs between the advantages and disadvantages of each type of weapon. What the authors here are proposing is what's sometimes called cost-benefit analysis, which is right now the most popular and promising version of decision analysis. There are a dozen, at least, different formal models for decision analysis, but since the cost-benefit one is a clear and simple one and a popular one, I'm going to stick to that model. Taking into account the costs and the benefits of each type of factors, of all these various factors, each type of weapon can be evaluated and then the summation value of each type of weapon will be calculated, and simply the police will choose the weapon that the majority of experts finally all agree on. The authors proudly point out that by the use of this type of decision analysis, nothing is left to mystery and intuition. The factors the experts use and the weights they assign are out in the open for everyone to see and to challenge, so that, quote, as a result, a process that was up to now poorly understood can be examined, assisted, and improved, unquote. In an age where experts are our only recourse in decisions concerning the environment, nuclear energy, drug use, etc., the idea that we could formalize expert advice so as to replace intuition and judgment with objective calculation is certainly attractive. But to be truly scientific, we have to be sure that the expert's expertise has indeed been captured in the formal model. That's where I want to start questioning this picture. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the picture in the sense that if we could do what the authors propose, capture the expertise in these factors and these weights, we'd all be better off. We could then see exactly how these people are making their decisions, and we could argue with them. We might even program a computer to use factors and weights and make faster, more accurate decisions. But before jumping to these wishful conclusions, we better check whether this is how decision-making really happens. And the way to do that, if you're going to be scientific about it, and I have nothing against being scientific about it, is to take some kind of simplified case of decision-making, presumably the simplest possible, where social value judgments don't even enter, and see how decision-making looks there, and then we'll worry about how it looks in the very complicated cases. Such a case is provided by the game of chess. It's especially because there is at every moment the player's decision as to which move of a bunch of possible alternative moves to make next. And chess is especially interesting because there have been studies of how chess masters decide upon a move. And there are also chess programs which exemplify the mechanical or formal model of how to decide upon a move. And this isn't a kind of straw man I've cooked up. I've taken the very best example of mechanical decision-making that exists as far as I know. That is, chess programs, having started out fairly pathetically, have, in the last few years, done surprisingly well. In 1977, a Northwestern chess program called Chess 4.5 won the Minnesota Open Chess Tournament against experts and high-class A players, which means that it would certainly beat me and probably everybody in this room, unless there are some masters lurking in the audience. And that last August, this kind of chess program competition came to a kind of finale because 10 years ago, some of you may have read about this, the people who were working on chess programs, particularly John McCarthy at Stanford, made a bet with an English chess master named David Levy, and the bet was over whether in a tournament Levy could beat a computer 10 years from the time the bet was made. And those 10 years were up last August, and there was this tournament between David Levy and the computer. And David Levy did win, but it was close, much closer than lots of people would have thought, much closer than I would have thought. I was ready to try to bet with McCarthy, but he wouldn't bet anymore. I would have won some money, but it would have been very, it was a cliffhanger. And in fact, and David Levy is a master, and the computer program did win one game. So there are, he had no, it wasn't as if he was sick that day or anything. It can play at master level. And so now that's very interesting because here we have a formal model that is making expert, in fact expert is a category of chess player, better than expert decisions because master is higher than expert in the way chess players are ranked. And chess programs do work like the description I just gave of a cost-benefit analysis. Chess masters are first asked to articulate the factors and trade-offs that they use in playing. Now, parentheses, it turns out to be very difficult to get chess masters to tell anybody what the factors and trade-offs that they use in playing, and we'll have more to say about that problem later. But so they are asked to do this, and they do it as best they can, They've even tried to follow their eye movements to see if they can sort of find out what rules they're using, even if they don't know what rules they're using. And finally, anyway, when you get the factors as best you can, and you find the weights that are assigned to the various factors, and use these weights to evaluate and compare various positions, you do get a chess-playing program that plays, as I just said, quite well. But now I have to go into more detail, because it's really in discussing, and I still stick to the chess example. I just have to hope that most of you are familiar enough with chess to just, having played a little, or even checkers, to follow this example. But it's very important to see the kind of factors that can be used and the kind of factors that can't be used when you're making a computer model of chess decision-making, that is, when you're making a chess-playing machine. To evaluate and compare positions, rules have to be provided for calculating scores on attributes such as material balance, where a numerical value is assigned to each piece on the board and the total score is computed for each player, or center control, for instance, where the number of pieces bearing on each centrally located square is counted. There have to be such attributes or features, or what I called earlier factors. And then there must be a formula for evaluating alternative positions on the basis of these scores. That's how a chess program works. And using this approach, and after looking at a number of moves and positions which included 3 million potential positions, Chess 4.5 played at which I said at almost master level. But the interesting thing to us is that chess masters, it's been found out, generally look at less than 100 possible moves. Now, the question that you have to start thinking about, and again, we're going to stick to chess because if we can understand it there, we can generalize it to more complicated cases, is what is it that chess masters are doing that enable them to generally come up with a better move looking at only at 100 possibilities than what the decision model computer program is doing, coming up with moves looking at 3 million possibilities? Well, it seems that what happens is that chess masters get their ability to zero in on the few really important moves by playing over and over again the book games, that is, the written down games of previous chess masters, or playing lots of games with each other, until they are somehow able to recognize what is important and interesting or relevant about a particular chess position. Presumably by, I'm sort of speculating here. I'll have to tell you what's fact and what's speculation. It seems to be, it's generally considered a fact that it's been proven that chess masters do only look at about 100 possibilities. What it is they do instead of that is the subject for much debate and speculation. Instead of looking at more, why is it that looking at so few they can do so well? And I'm giving you, and another fact is that they couldn't do this so well if they hadn't played many, many, many games. And another fact I might as well mention is it's got something to do with their sense of what is going on deeply in an ongoing chess game, because it's not just that they have very good memories or think very fast or something like that, because you can show, it turns out that if a chess master looks at a board position for just a few moments, he can reproduce the whole position, whereas if a beginner looks at a board position for a few moments, he can't. But that only works if it's a real board position. If you show a chess master a bunch of randomly, the same number of pieces, randomly, but legally, let's say, but just stupidly arranged on the board, he can't reproduce the position any better than the purest Potzer. So the question then is, it's got something to do with having developed a deep sense of the game by playing all these games. My speculation is that the player learns how to recognize present positions as similar to positions which have occurred in classic games. And these previous positions have already been analyzed in terms of their significant aspects. Now, I'm using aspects in a very technical sense here, which is my own word. It doesn't matter what word you use, but I want to distinguish aspects from attributes. Attributes, remember, were things like center control and material balance. And the interesting thing about attributes is that you don't have to know anything about chess to calculate the attributes. If material balance means simply count up the numerical value of the pieces on each side after a certain exchange, somebody who doesn't even know how to play chess can do it, and a computer can do it. I mean, a computer is something that doesn't know how to play chess until you put this program in it, and it calculates material balance, or it calculates center control. Anybody can be told, count the number of pieces that are aiming at the center. Maybe you have to tell them what aiming is. That is how each piece can move, but anybody can learn that. But aspects are a much more interesting sort of thing. I would say aspects of a chess position include overall characteristics, global characteristics. And for example, and here I have to depend on the knowledge of my brother, who's a very good chess player. I haven't reached the stage where I see anything but attributes. That's where most beginners are. But if you play a lot of chess, you apparently see things like control of the situation, the extent to which a player's opponent's moves can be forced by your threatening moves. Or another aspect, crampedness of the position, the amount of freedom of maneuver inherent in both players' position, the player's position and the opponent's position. Or, and here's a nice one, overextendedness, the fact that while the position might be superficially quite strong, one's not in sufficient control of the situation to follow through, and with correct play by the opponent, a massive retreat will be required. It's in terms of aspects like that, control of the situation, crampedness, overextendedness, that really good chess players talk to each other about games and analyze games. And I'm presuming that the already analyzed and remembered positions focus the player's attention on these critical aspects of the current position so that the master can zero in on the critical areas before he begins to count out specific moves. If I do this, he does that, and if I do this, he does that. Whereas the computer, with only attributes to go on, simply counts out for 7 exchanges ahead everything that he does and I do and he does and I do, and then does this analysis at the end of costs, benefits, that is, of weighs the various factors against each other and calculates the value of these final positions. But the computer doesn't have this capacity to zero in on what's important, because the computer doesn't have a sense of the game as a developing totality with a strategy. One way to put the difference is that the computers play only tactically. They just play a certain number ahead and then calculate which of all the possible moves that you could make and that the opponent could make would get you to the best position 7 moves ahead. Whereas chess masters play not tactically but strategically. They have some long-range game. They're either playing defensive or aggressive. They're either planning to attack the king side or the queen side, and so forth. So the distinction between features and aspects is central to what I'm going to talk about. Aspects play a role in any account of human play or decision-making in general, similar to the role that features play in a formal model of such decision-making. But there is a very crucial difference, which is already implicit in what I've been saying. In a formal model, a mechanical model, a computer model, the situation is defined in terms of the features or attributes. Whereas in human decision-making, situational understanding is prior to aspect specification. That is, you have to understand what's going on in the game before you know whether a particular position is cramped or overextended. For example, the numerical value of a feature such as material balance can be calculated independently of any understanding of the game. Whereas if you look for overextendedness, you have to see it, the same position could be overextended or not, depending on the long-range strategy of the game. In a game in which White's long-range strategy is an attack on the opponent's king, the advanced position of White's pieces doesn't constitute overextension. Whereas if White was playing a defensive position, it would. And since no present or envisaged chess program includes long-range strategy, because it doesn't have whatever it is that human players get by playing lots of games. No chess program is able to recognize aspects. A chess program has to begin with whatever you can recognize as context-free features that don't presume any expertise. It builds its expertise, so to speak, out of starting with what any dumb creature could see. Whereas I want to say experts go around the other way, and they see what's going on in the game in terms of the expertise they've already got. No feature-based matching of the present. Well, I want to also clear up a possible way that one might think you could get around this. You might think that you could have a stored library of previous positions, and a computer could certainly have that. And then it could look up previous positions which had features like the present position and see how things went in certain moves from that position and reach its move from there. But this won't help at all. And you have to think about why it won't help at all, why a stored library of particular positions and what happens. You could just store a library of particular positions and exactly what move Botvinnik or some great player made when he was in that position that made a winning game. But it won't help because it's astronomically unlikely that two positions will ever turn up which are identical. So what would have to be compared were similar positions. But similarity can't be defined as having a large number of pieces on identical squares. Similarity can't be defined in terms of attributes at all. Two positions which are identical, except for one pawn moved to an adjacent square, could be totally different. Think of an extreme case where the pawn's about to be promoted to a queen. Whereas two positions can be similar, although no two pieces are on the same square in each. But the crampedness or the aggressiveness or the overextendedness and so forth doesn't matter about the squares. It's the overall gestalt. Thus, similarity depends upon the player's sense of the issues at stake, not merely on the position of the pieces. Seeing two positions as similar is exactly what requires a deep understanding of the game. And only structuring the situation in terms of aspects of remembered similar situations enables the human player to avoid the massive counting out required when the positions are characterized only in terms of context-free features. So already we've got one important clue as to the difference between what an expert might know in terms of aspects and what a scientific analysis of the sort proposed by the authors I quoted in the beginning of a cost-benefit analysis would look like, because this cost-benefit analysis, any formal analysis, is going to have to be strictly in terms of factors, attributes, features, whatever you call it, elements. It's a question is whether it's context-free, whether you already have to understand in order to find these features or not. The formal model always says you have to start with features that you don't understand, and you don't have to understand anything. You could just calculate them. Now, another important difference, which is analogous here, just as what in the formal model, the role in the formal model that's served by features, in the human model, let's call it, the intuitive model, let's give it this pejorative name, because by the end of this talk, I hope I'm going to convince you that being intuitive is not such a bad thing after all, even if it's very mysterious. In the intuitive picture, you've got aspects. Well, there's a parallel also that's interesting to note, that where in the formal model you've got strict rules for calculating, given the features, what the value of a position is, or what you should do. In the intuitive model, you have what are called maxims, at least what Michael Polanyi calls maxims, and that's as good a word as any. And I want to read you a quote from Polanyi's description of the difference between maxims and rules, because it comes to, again, discovering the same difference that I've been trying to emphasize. He says, "Maxims are rules, the correct application of which is part of the art which they govern. The true maxims of golfing or of poetry increase our insight into golfing or poetry, and may even give valuable guidance to golfers and poets. But these maxims would instantly condemn themselves to absurdity if they tried to replace the golfer's skill or the poet's art. Maxims cannot be understood, still less applied, by anyone not already possessing a good practical knowledge of the art." So it's the same thing again. Just like aspects can't be understood unless you already have a deep understanding of chess, deeper than mine. So the maxims which you might give to some expert can't be understood until you've already got a deep understanding of the game. Otherwise, you can give rules. Just as you've got features in chess like material balance or center control, you've got rules. Rules like what? I hadn't thought of writing one down. You might give somebody a rule like castle as soon as you can in the game. I was playing one of this thing called the Chess Challenger, which you see advertised a lot now, at a rather low level, stage 3 or something, and it was obviously following the rule castle as soon as you can in the game. Once you saw it was following that rule, you could play all kinds of nasty tricks on it. But there would be rules for beginners, but they would be rules that anybody could follow who didn't even understand what was going on. Okay, in general, being able to see similarity to typical cases and to recognize shared aspects in terms of the similarity, as well as the possibility of profiting from maxims formulated in terms of all these aspects, all this seems to play an essential role in the acquisition and utilization of expertise. If this is so, then we can understand why masters have such trouble articulating the factors they use. And the same for the experts that we were trying to understand who are trying to help us make social policy. They have such trouble articulating the factors they use, the weights they assign, the rules they use for calculating the value of a position. What I want to say now is that it may well be that the reason they have such trouble articulating their factors and rules is because they're not using factors and rules at all. Now, we'll get back to this in a minute. They may have learned using factors and rules. I presume if you start with chess, that's what you do. You have to learn about material balance, about center control, and rules like try castling every time you get the chance. But by the time you become a master, you're not using those rules. And why should we suppose that you're using any rules at all? But if they're not using any rules at all, and I won't state that dogmatically, I'll try to defend that more in a minute, this would have serious consequences for the hope of an objective science of decision-making. If we can't tap expertise by asking the experts how much weight they put on the factors, then we can't externalize the experts' judgments, to talk like that article. For example, to give you a feel for this, it might not help to ask an expert, intuitive, successful businessman how much weight he puts on the factor of customer confidence versus the factor of coming out fast with a new product, even if it might fail. He's likely to tell you, well, it depends, meaning he needs to know a lot more about the situation. I read an article where the decision analyst got very annoyed and thought that there must be something stupid about these experts because they couldn't even understand what he was trying to get at. They kept saying it all depends. And then Socrates had the same exasperation with Euthyphro. Euthyphro kept saying, well, I'm doing it because that's what the gods tell me to do, or I'm doing it because I can see that my father is a wicked man. And Socrates kept saying, no, you must have a principle. What's your principle? Well, I'm saying that when they say it all depends, that's not stupidity. That's they've got a lot of experience about total situations and about what the significant aspects are and how it all hangs together. And they may not, on the basis of their experience, have ever thought about these factors. And I picture them asking the generals questions like, how much weight do you put on number of casualties versus miles of territory gained? And if they did have any experienced generals in land warfare, and they probably did, who'd had read lots of battles and maybe fought lots of battles, they didn't presumably know how much weight they put on these factors. They didn't think about it in terms of these factors. But if they were forced to give some kind of value, they said, well, I don't know, I think that the trade-off is such and such and such. Then you build a model that makes up war strategies and war games like that. It's likely to be very stupid because you're not tapping the expertise of the expert when you ask him how much weight he puts on the factors if his expertise consists in his doing this without weights and factors. And by questioning experts about rules and factors, you reduce them to what they learned in business school or in the military academy, but what they presumably left behind when, with talent and experience, they became experts. That's exactly as I said with chess. I mean, people do start with rules and factors and weights, but presumably that's exactly what they get over when they get to be good. The fact that people once use rules to acquire expertise is often explicitly or implicitly assumed to justify the claim that they're still using rules. Thus, even though it doesn't seem to fit the facts, the formal model gains an apparent plausibility from a superficial description of the acquisition of expertise. So I want to give you what I take to be a description of the acquisition of expertise in a few cases, so to give you a feel for the implausibility of that model. To take a very extreme case, for example, a blind person already familiar with curbs who is learning to use a probe to recognize curbs. I mean, presumably he's walked over them. He knows what a curb is, but he hasn't used a probe to feel them. Well, as a beginner, presumably, he will experience changing pressures in the palm of his hand and interpret these elements or factors or features as evidence of certain attributes of the surfaces and edges and so forth out at the end of his probe and decide what's out there on the basis of that. According to the classical formal model, these attributes would be used to decide whether the object falls into the class curve defined in terms of a certain set of attributes. The classical formal model, though, although appropriate for beginners, cannot explain this, what happens when you extend this to a skilled human performance. You only need to notice that when you or a blind person, anybody, finally learns how to use a probe and becomes skilled and proficient at it, then you're no longer aware of pressures in the palm of the hand, giving you attributes of objects out there. The blind person, and presumably anybody using a probe, becomes directly aware of or directly experiences the curve with its characteristics at the end of the stick. That is a total transformation of experience. I took this to be as a dramatic example as possible. A total transformation of experience takes place in which the attributes and the calculations and judgments and decisions disappear altogether, and one just simply feels that you're now out there at the end of the stick feeling the objects. I think that generally in the acquisition of cognitive skills, the beginner starts with the sort of second-order features and rules used in the formal model. Never mind second order. I say that because of certain complications with neurophysiology. I'll get to that in a minute. It begins with the features and rules used in the formal model. Just as we said, chess players start with numerical values for the pieces and strict rules instead of maxims for how to win exchanges and so forth. Language students learn grammatical rules when they're learning a second language. Pilots learn the rules for the sequence of operations required to fly airplanes. And in each such case, as long as the beginner is following such rules, his performance is halting, rigid, and mediocre. As I take it, everybody knows who's at least learned a second language or learned to drive a car. And also in each case, as anybody knows who's acquired expertise or proficiency in a skill, with the mastery of the activity comes the transformation, which we noted in the case of the blind man and his cane. The performer is no longer aware of features and rules, and his performance becomes fluid, flexible, and highly proficient. The chess player develops a feel for a game. The language learner becomes fluent. The pilot stops feeling that he is flying the plane and simply feels that he is flying. The suspicion that the features and rules have become unconscious, which is the suspicion that guides the scientific model of getting it back out of the experts because they've lost the consciousness of the rules, can't account for the fact that after this transformation, the style of the behavior is radically changed and the performance dramatically improved. Moreover, if the features and rules have simply dropped out of consciousness without in any way being transformed, how can one account for the fact that if a skilled performer becomes aware of the elementary actions that he once was aware of when he acquired the skill, his performance is degraded to even worse than that of a beginner? That is, you try to pay attention to how you type or how you drive or how you speak a foreign language, and the whole thing just falls apart. Polanyi discusses this case and concludes that reflective attention to the features, that is, to what, not that the features are already there, but newly singling out the features, destroys one's sense of the context which alone can smoothly evoke the proper sequence of words, notes, or gestures. And furthermore, just to give you all the arguments I can think of, one would think that the rules and features have been really forgotten, because it's fascinating to ask yourself, if you touch type, for instance, which finger you type the letter B with. Once you actually did that according to a rule, you saw, you knew what finger to move, and you moved it, you decided in this rule-like way. Now if you've acquired the skill, something so totally different is happening that you don't even know the answer to that question. The only way to find out is to pretend you're typing the word boy or something and find out which finger moves. So I would say then that scientific evidence suggests that the formal model of the acquisition of expertise is simply mistaken. When one acquires a skill, driving, speaking, flying, or whatever it may be, there's a moment when, with more or less suddenness, the original rules and attributes are left behind. And only then do you have the kind of expert intuition, which is what one wants to tap when you call in the experts in the first place. This mysterious intuition, this wisdom, this whole thing which in the original article was what we wanted to get around. It seems, to take one more example, which is interesting, that in fact only by dropping the rules can you become really proficient. I came across an example from studies in the Air Force which showed that you train undergraduate pilots to follow a fixed sequence of visual scanning of instruments and dials. And in studying this, they found that the instructors who were giving out these rules could find errors in visual displays much more quickly than the trainees. So they wondered, how was that? Did they just simply unconsciously apply the rules much more quickly and much more accurately? So they checked their eye movements, and it showed that the instructors weren't using the rules that they were instructing the trainees in at all. The instructors showed, and it was just in this way that they could do so much better with in novel scanning tests than the trainees with the rigid scanning patterns that they were teaching, which suggests that proficient performance does not consist in following these steps that the trainees were being taught, and that they would also leave all that behind when they got as proficient as the instructors. Okay, let's sum up where we are. So far, I've argued that experienced and expert human decision makers solve new problems by seeing in them similarities to previously experienced situations. Now, I want to make a kind of parenthetical, which I haven't mentioned. That procedure is mysterious in one sense, but not in another sense. This has to be cleared up at some point. When people do this thing of seeing aspects, maxims, and having the whole skill globally transformed, it may be that their behavior is no longer explainable in the way that Socrates and the believers in scientific decision-making want to explain it. It doesn't mean that their behavior isn't somehow explainable. That is, presumably something happens on the neurophysiological level in their brain, and that if we understood what was going on in their brain, we'd have an explanation of what happened. But we wouldn't have any necessarily, and if all this phenomenology is right, there's no evidence at all to think we would find the rules and features somehow encoded in the neurophysiology. There may be holograms, gestalts, fields, anything else. I want to say that what happens in the brain isn't mysterious. It only becomes mysterious if you think that you have to have another level of explanation in terms of rules and features, where the whole thing is externalized and spelled out. If you can't get that, if that's what being mysterious means, it's very mysterious. But mysterious doesn't mean mystical, or that it doesn't happen according to the rules of physics and chemistry. It just doesn't happen according to the rules of cost-benefit analysis. There's no evidence, in other words, that it can be explained in terms of rules applied to isolated attributes of the situation. And there are many reasons which I've given you to believe that it can't. While the formal model has the attractive feature desired by advocates of scientific decision-making of laying bare and arguable the complete explanation of a decision, it in no way represents the actual process through which expert planners decide. Since the similarity-based process actually used by experienced human beings ultimately leads to better performance in all areas than does the formal approach practiced by beginners, decision-making based on proven expertise should neither be replaced by formal models, nor should proven experts feel any obligation to explain their decision in terms of formal models. Okay, so what's the role of formal models then? I just want to talk for a minute about that before I conclude. That doesn't mean that there isn't a role for formal models in expert decision-making and policy-making. It implies that formal models can provide help, however, only in an area where the problem is so combinatorial or statistical that experience doesn't lead to expertise. That is, there may be problems just so messy that there's no way for human beings to keep track of everything that's going on. There isn't any restructuring and understanding, even after you've seen lots of examples. Apparently this happens in routing problems, sequencing problems, petroleum blending problems, production scheduling problems. I mean, there are whole areas of this in applied mathematics where you can actually give helpful analyses which do better than people. They do better than people because there are no experts. And in any area in which there aren't any experts, it's fine to use the formal model. What I want to say is, however, that in most policy decisions, like affecting the environment, clean air decisions, or drug marketing decisions and so forth, it's not that we have a tremendously difficult combinatorial problem. We have a problem which is of a familiar, much more modest sort, and in that sort of problem, if there are experts, then the last thing one wants to do is to force the experts to give you the factors and the weights, because then then you will be exactly losing their expertise. Now that leads to one final point. You can turn any problem into a very complicated and combinatorial looking problem if you try to be detached and objective about it. That is, you can try to think of all the possibly relevant factors, all the possible alternatives that could happen to all those possibly relevant factors. For instance, if you're trying to decide where to build a nuclear reactor or whether you should build any. You can turn this into a problem so combinatorial and so statistical that only decision analysis can cope with it. So it turns out to be a much more interesting and complicated question than it looks at first. You can't just say, leave the experts deal with the simple problems and call in the computers and scientific decision-making when the problem becomes complicated. There's a kind of moral choice behind all this as to whether how the problem is complicated, how you understand a problem at all. This became clear to me when I read and think I understood something about Japanese business decision-making. Again, I'll separate the facts from my interpretation of the facts. I've never seen any satisfactory interpretation of the facts, but the fact is that when Japanese businessmen get together to make a policy decision about how to expand or where to market a product or whether to start a new product, they do what would we consider very strange things. They reminisce about the history of the company. They recite poetry to each other. They think about the kinds of things that they would like to have happen, and they remember the heroes of the company and so forth. And somehow out of this, a consensus and a decision emerges. Where I'll try to, it's so bizarre that at first you don't even know what that could possibly mean. And it's so bizarre to us because in our ideal model, when the executives get together to make a decision, what do? They list all the possible conceivable alternatives, and the cleverer they are, the more far out conceivable alternatives they list, and the probabilities, and the values of the consequences down all the lines of branching consequences. And then if they've got a decision analyst expert, they can sum all that up, and they can, which no human being can grasp anymore. They've been so clever at thinking of factors. And then they have to ask the formal model, well, what have we concluded? It's beyond our own grasp anymore. We could give you the factors and utilities, but we can't even understand the solution. Now, what's happening?
Well, it's like two ways of thinking, I think, about, say, any ordinary human decision, like moving to a new job in a new area. What the Japanese are doing, I think, is trying to understand what the history of the company is, what it stands for, and what its goals are. And after you've understood that, there'll only be a few alternatives left. And what seems to be the right thing to do will pretty well force itself upon you. Whereas if you start thinking about as if you weren't involved, as if you came from nowhere, as what a sort of Martian would see as all the abstract possibilities, then it becomes a tremendous combinatorial problem. I mean, to take the most extreme case, which is obviously a terrible oversimplification, if you were trying to decide whether to marry somebody, you could think of all the factors, personality factors, economic factors, social factors, genetic factors, and all the probabilities and so forth, and you'd never be able to make a decision. But what you try to do is to get yourself so into the situation and get in touch with who you are and who you want to be, so that the decision becomes not so much a decision between alternatives, but finally what you have to do becomes obvious. I think that's the general point of the Japanese approach. What happens to us in the Western tradition is we're really trying, I think, to abnegate our involvement and our moral choice. We'd like to turn this into a detached, objective decision where our feelings and desires and our past histories and our judgment about what kind of person we'd like to be or what kind of country we'd like this to be or what kind of environment we'd like to have doesn't play any role, because that's subjective and arbitrary and intuitive. So what we'd like to do is list all the factors objectively and put all the weights on and do the calculation, so that that turns every problem into a multi-attribute problem, and then it looks like the expert could be best replaced by a computer. But I think what's really happening is that we've changed the question. The issue in these environmental problems, in the nuclear reactor problems, in the drug development problems is really something like who we are, what we think humanity is supposed to be all about, what sort of quality of life we want. And we're all experts, more or less, in what it is to be human. And we know what aspects of the situation are relevant and which are not to these quality of life decisions. Indeed, it's just the sort of expertise about what kind of life we want, which is based upon experience, which is lost in this mechanical model of decision-making. And we also know when it's too much for us, when the problem is too difficult for us or beyond our kind of expertise, and then we know who to turn to for the wisdom. That is, if we can't decide the problem, then we can turn to somebody that has the kind of wisdom from past experience, a kind of expertise, who can make a choice in those matters. And even when we have to turn the decision over to experts, we can choose experts who share our sense of human values. And since life makes us all more or less experts in deciding whom we can trust, we should use that expert knowledge to identify the most reliable source of expertise. So it's not foolish, as the writers of this article said, to call in persons noted for their wisdom when you need a decision like this. That is, finally, I think, that the attraction of scientific decision-making is that it would eliminate, if it worked, subjectivity, arbitrariness, intuition, mystery, and all the risks that go with that. But I really think that there's no way to eliminate uncertainty, risk, and intuition, and that only if we accept risk and mystery can we hope to base our public policy on the judgment of those whose advice is the most likely to help us to achieve the kind of world we want. Okay, question?